We're now going to talk about behavior problems in adolescence. What fun! The early care summary variable was significantly correlated with total behavior problems at age 16, both based on the teacher alone and on the combination of teacher, parent, and adolescent ratings. The measure of care at school entry, that was the grade 1 home scale score, yielded a significant but a small correlation, so that's why it has a thin arrow. Measures of competence in elementary school all yielded stronger correlations, as did relationship support for the mother at that time. Remember, if the mother is getting adequate support, then she's in a better position to provide more adequate caregiving. Behavior problem history was, as you would expect, quite predictive. For example, externalizing in grades 1 through 3 correlated 0.42 with teacher-rated problems at age 16. They were able to show, however, that externalizing experiences within the family still were important even after taking behavior problems into account. For example, the parent-child boundary dissolution at age 13 predicted change in behavior problems between grade 6 and age 16, with boundary dissolution making things worse. Recall that at earlier ages they'd found that maltreatment affected core adaptational functioning at each age, from attachment in infancy to self-regulation in the toddler period and to later self-management. By the time the maltreated child has reached adolescence, major differentiation and integration of social, emotional, cognitive, and other systems that occur during this period were also severely affected. They found that membership in any of the maltreatment groups, so that would include physical abuse, psychological unavailability, neglect, and sexual abuse, was in each case related to significant problems, and in each case predicted the likelihood of some psychiatric treatment, like therapy or even medication. 90% of these children qualified for at least one psychiatric diagnosis by the age of 17. Measures of severity of physical abuse and neglect were both significantly related to total behavior problems. Sexual abuse was related to the broadest range of problems, from withdrawal and anxiety and attention problems to aggression, delinquency, and heavy drug use. Even with SES controlled for, various forms of maltreatment history added to the prediction of various kinds of behavior problems. Every form of maltreatment was related to delinquency, with a history of psychological unavailability being the strongest predictor. Allen reasoned that this was because of the legacy of anger, negativity, and defiance in these children, and the lack of monitoring that was provided by their parents in adolescence. It's likely, for this latter reason, neglect also predicted delinquency, even though these children tended not to be aggressive or defiant. As was the case with earlier periods, there was some patterning to these links between maltreatment and behavior problems, even though most of the groups had a range of problems. In accord with the principle of multifinality, patterns of consequences could be seen. In other words, they might all have ended up with lots of delinquent behavior, but the path that they took to get there was different for the different types of maltreatment. Membership in the neglect group was the only predictor of school achievement problems once SES was controlled for, but neglect did not predict aggression, cutting school, or heavy drug use, as did a history of physical abuse. The neglect group did use more alcohol than the controls, but they didn't get into trouble with it. Physically abused children were distinguished by heavy drug use, and they were frequently in trouble, including being defiant, aggressive, and often truant from school. Those in the psychologically unavailable group were distinguished by the pattern of aggression, social problems, and isolation as manifested in elevated suicide attempts. What are your thoughts about the mechanisms that are involved in this pathway? What does it mean for the child to experience a parent as psychologically unavailable? Despite all the negative outcomes that I've been talking about, there was evidence for change as well. Some children that had histories of maltreatment were doing relatively well. Factors that were associated with positive change included an early history of support and competence, an alternative available caregiver like the other parent or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, some other family member, or maybe even the next door neighbor, a good school, and an organized home environment. What do you think this might mean for interventions?